Hi, thanks for joining us for webinar number 2 in our beginning series of Teach Emotional Regulation and Change Student Behavior. This is the science and research section we talked about last time. So I am again Lori Jackson. My colleague Steve Peck is not with me today, but I will be taking you through the background science on why emotional regulation is so critical to understanding how kids manage their emotions, and especially how we can teach kids to manage their emotions, and that will change their behavior. And then we'll talk a little bit about our new program, Ready to Learn, and the Kid Connect app that we developed. So again, I take you back. We looked at this in our first webinar. It's hard to learn when you're focused on how you feel. So what we know as human beings, our emotions drive our behaviors. That is the underlying theme in our work. And so as a child, when you're focused on your emotions and they overwhelm you and you don't have anything to help manage them, this is pretty much what it looks like or can look like in a classroom. And what we say and what we know is that our students are displaying these behavioral issues because they can't understand their emotions and they can't manage them. And our job as educators is to teach them the skills to do so. Just like we would teach them math skills, reading skills, spelling skills. I'm like a broken record. If you keep listening to our webinars, you will hear me say this all the time. This is just like teaching math, except it's teaching emotions. We talked last time about the core features of certain disabilities. Why are we struggling with kids who have different disabilities, yet at their core, what we're seeing, the feel that we have for what is really playing into their difficulties is emotional dysregulation. And so let's talk about the parts of the brain, how we understand regulation, how we understand how we can fix or support or help or teach emotional regulation. So first, let's define it. Basically, the conscious or unconscious control of mood, emotion, or affect. It's a process that you go through automatically most of the time if you've learned this piece of control, if you've learned to identify, understand, and manage your emotions. It happens throughout the day. It's how you navigate your day. It's what you will attend to. It's your interpretation of situations and how you respond to situations. So if you could pick a more critical piece of your life, it would have to be emotional regulation. It would have to be the way you understand, manage, and process emotions, because it's the core of everything that you'll do. And if you know how to manage your emotions, this seems maybe melodramatic to you. Maybe you're saying to yourself, Lori, this is way over the top because really emotions aren't that important. They're not driving everything. And that's coming from a person who knows how to deal with their emotions and not let it derail them. If you are a child who hasn't yet gotten those skills, or if you are a child who has a disability or maybe has experienced trauma, or if you're an adult who has the same situation, this is really going to take over your life until you have learned the skills to make the change. And that's why we're here. So let's talk emotional regulation and the brain. So you may have heard this information out there. The limbic system in our brain is basically the emotional center. It's most heavily implicated, as we have on the slide, in emotion and memory. And so the processes within this system are basically what control our physical reaction and emotional response to any kind of environmental stimuli or any kind of interaction. And what the limbic system does is it is the fight or flight area, right? So it's our ancient part of our brain, which from an evolutionary standpoint kept us alive, because, if there was a problem happening, we needed to be able to realize immediately that there was a threat to our safety and do something about it. as we have changed and as we've learned more, basically we know that this is the area that controls all of emotional responses. Main areas within that are hippocampus, hypothalamus, and amygdala. And what we're going to talk about in these areas is how critical they are in terms of managing emotions, but also how critical these areas are for how we teach kids. So in the amygdala, what we know is this area is sort of an automatic response, right? We talked about fight or flight, and it's based on previous experience. So in essence, it's learned. It is a learned experience that you will focus on, and that will then drive your reaction. Also, it's conditioned. So something, as we know how behavior is conditioned, so your reaction to something gets conditioned over time, and that becomes your reaction unless you override it. So this is important when we think about kids who have automatic trigger. You know, we look at kids who have an automatic trigger response to something, and yet even though we've taught them and they can tell us when they're calm that, oh, I know, the next time I'm going to do something else, their automatic response is going to be what's learned unless it's practiced. If we talk about the hippocampus, it reactions again based on past associations, and it's a triggered response. It's what you've done before. So we talk about this area in that negative loop, right? If you've ever thought about behavior as a negative cycle, this area is involved in the negative cycle. And another key element here is that the hippocampus is context-dependent learning. So where you learn, how you learn what you learn is as important, and how you pair that learning is as important as anything else. And this has great value when we talk about where and how we teach kids to manage their emotions. I'm just going to put a pin in this in your brain. Where do we do most of our work with kids who have emotional issues or have behavior issues? We do a whole lot of work outside the classroom in an office, and then we have an expectation that that is going to generalize. And so what we learn and know about this limbic system, the hippocampus, is that that's not the way our limbic system works the best in terms of learning. So this is critical. Another critical area that you've probably heard a lot about when you've talked about executive functions is the prefrontal cortex. The significance of this area is it controls the emotional recovery time. So how long it's going to take from some kind of outburst where the limbic system is triggered and is activated, how fast will the prefrontal cortex, the executive areas, be able to manage that emotion? Prefrontal cortex can override or inhibit the response or the reaction of the amygdala. We talk about it in terms of a triggered limbic system, and the prefrontal cortex can take over. We want that rational part of the brain to engage when we have a situation with a child or ourselves or whatever. When we become overly emotional, we need to be able to trigger our prefrontal cortex, our rational brain, to take over, to inhibit the emotional response so that we can have a more balanced, measured, typical, appropriate, on-target response to an event or a situation or a stimuli in our environment. What's very significant in this area, and to think about with both the limbic and the prefrontal cortex areas, is that practice and training can change an overly emotional response or a triggered limbic system into a more managed, rational response. So this is good news, because what that means for us is that learning is able to take place. How do we learn? And how do we recondition our behavior is what's critical. And so what many of you know, what they taught us in grad school as psychologists is, one of the things, is that we can condition our behavior, right? So this is a very well-known concept. So we can condition by association. So everybody knows, I tell the story all the time of my very adorable dog who has been conditioned to the sound of the cheese drawer opening in our refrigerator. Even if he is sleeping on the couch, he will hear the drawer open in the refrigerator and he will immediately wake up and come flying over to see if someone's going to give him cheese. Why is that? Well, because at one point, I'm sure it wasn't me, I'm sure it was my children, opened the drawer of the cheese drawer. He heard the noise. They gave him cheese. He loved it. And he learned noise equals cheese. He didn't have to be given food every single time, but just that pairing of the sound with the food, now every time, food doesn't need to be there, but as long as he hears that drawer, he's ready to go. So that's a conditioned response. That's a behavioral conditioned response. But emotions can also be conditioned. And so this is a very famous study conducted a very long time ago where an emotion can be conditioned in the very same way we are conditioning the we-conditioned behavior, which is the same kind of idea where you pair something negative with a fearful or a fear eliciting stimulus, and that conditions fear even if the shock or a loud noise isn't there. So what we know is that not only can we condition behavior, but we can condition our emotions. So why is that important? Well, what we know is that as educators, we spend a lot of time looking at our students and trying to change their behavior without trying to change the emotion that's driving the behavior. So what we need to realize and sort of reshape and rethink is how are we expecting our students, or ourselves for that matter, to change our behavior if we're just simply replacing that behavior with something else. What we need to be doing, because the science behind all of this is telling us that if you repair and recondition the emotion that's been conditioned to something negative and you change it to something positive, that will ultimately change the behavior that we're looking to modify or change. What we've seen in the time that sort of supports all of this is that researchers are doing amazing studies that are really showing that the underlying, the core features of so many disabilities and so many issues are really that the inability in some ways for kids to regulate their emotions is different in kids with autism, that ADHD really is a function of an inability to self-regulate, which is so different than in some ways we really manage ADHD as a disability in our schools, because typically we're looking at attention, and what we really need to be looking at are the emotions that are driving the behaviors, because once we get those in check, we're going to substantially change behavior, or the ability for behavior. And another interesting piece, and so they've seen this in studies with ASD individuals, students, children, adults on the spectrum, is that the strategies that they use are not ones that really help. They're using maladaptive strategies to manage their emotions. So what that says is we have the ability to change and to make strategies more successful and that will have benefit for changing behavior if we pair them with behavior and emotion and we teach in that way. And so why is this even possible? What makes it even reasonable to think that we can, I like to say, teach an old brain new tricks? Not that my brain is old. But the concept of neuroplasticity is one that has emerged in recent years and is really an amazingly hopeful way of approaching behavior change, real behavior change from emotional regulation. The more we repeat a certain behavior, the stronger the pathway is in the brain, right? So when you do something and you repeat a negative pattern, let's say it's speeding, you do it all the time, it makes it harder to change. But when we learn a new skill, the more attention we pay to it, the more we practice it, the easier it will become. The best way I can describe this for you is think about learning how to shoot free throws in basketball. I can't play basketball, but if I could, and if I wanted to practice a lot, I actually could just keep practicing, and eventually, through repetition, my muscles would learn how to release the basketball well, and I would eventually get better. Well, guess what? It's the exact same way when you're teaching kids how to identify, understand, and manage their emotions. It's the same way. The more repetition you have, the more you practice, the more you pair the new strategy or behavior with an emotion, the better the kids will be able to manage the emotion. There's critical things here. This can't be done in a corner in an office without, and we need to change the way we are delivering supports for kids, for all kids. So when we want to teach new patterns of thinking and new skills, we need to do it in the environment where we want it to happen, and we need to do it as close to the moment of incident or event as possible. And here's why. When we think back to the way the limbic system functions and the way those different areas of the brain take in information and use that information, we need to do it in the way they function. What we're doing right now is we are not giving, in essence, those brains the best environment and the best way to make lasting change. So we're going to change where we deliver support, and we're going to do it and not wait to let kids process the issues later on. We're going to teach them right in the moment, and we're going to do it right in the classroom. And the final piece here, the most sort of important thing, is how do we do it? What's the methodology? What's the philosophy behind how we want to change ultimately behavior by teaching kids to identify, understand, and manage their emotions? Well, we want to use a philosophy or an idea that pairs and reconditions behavior and emotions at the same time. Best way to do that is using a cognitive behavioral approach. That means that we pair event, emotion, and behavior, and that allows us to find a different pattern, a different way, a different, in essence, cycle, and that leads us for lasting change. So, with that in mind, when we started working and realizing that we needed to do something different because there were no tools to help our students, we utilized a cognitive behavioral approach, and we said, you know what, we need to give kids something in the moment that's going to help them, which is where Kid Connect, the app, came from. And so what happens with the app is that students pair their behaviors with their feelings. They immediately learn replacement strategies, which change negative, or what we call off-target behaviors, to on-target behaviors, and they get to have that done right in the classroom. They do it independently, the app stores all the information, and the kids move on. what it does is it helps students make the connection between how they feel and how they behave. So over time, they learn to pair and to identify their own feelings, and then they make different choices on target behaviors so that they're ready to learn. I caution everybody when we talk about stuff like this is it doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. This is real work. This is difficult work. But if you're consistent, the science, which is why we went through this whole process, the science is there that backs that this is the way to do it as long as you're consistent and you have patience. The other process that we talked about was, everyone's talking about social emotional learning programs and how do we get kids to be more in touch with themselves, but also empathetic and show all of these positive life qualities that we want them to have. And our concept was, well, you know what? We need a social emotional learning program that teaches kids their emotions, their behaviors, strategies, and then mindfulness all in a process where it helps kids identify and understand their emotions. They get to manage the emotions that drive those behaviors, and they use mindfulness with strategies, and this allows them to really create lasting change of their behaviors so they're ready to learn in your classroom. So this was our science and research behind the program. Key elements here. Limbic system is the area that has all the emotions that we manage and deal with. But our prefrontal cortex, because it's our rational brain, can override the limbic system when we have emotional issues, as long as we know the right steps to do it. And so our job as educators is to use the process that we understand to help kids learn how to override their limbic system so that the rational part of the brain can lead, and so they're able to sit in your classrooms learning. Next up, we're going to dive more into Kid Connect, the app, and the Ready to Learn program so that you can get an idea of how you really can help kids to identify, manage, and understand their emotions and choose on-target behaviors. So this was a lot of information. I hope you were able to grasp all of it. If you have any questions, if you want to ask for a deeper dive, any additional resources, anything, just reach out. There are our emails, and we would love to hear from you. Thanks for joining us for webinar number 2. Stay tuned. Number 3 is next.